Thanks.
Thank you for finding the time for this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for being here. So first time I did this talk was for the Interaction Conference, where I presented this. So I'm a UX designer by trade, currently working as a head of design for a German e-commerce company. This talk, though, has nothing to do, or it has a lot to do with work as such, but it's my own opinion and not that of my employer. So take it with a pinch of salt. I started talking about or asking myself, what is job love? Drudgery, devotion, and design, called it a meet cute. And if you don't know what a meet cute is, it's this first encounter between future romantic partners. It can be charming, funny, awful, full of animosity, just really awkward. And it sets the tone for the rest of the story. So think of, I don't know, Leia and Han Solo, or Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, or Harry and Sally. And today I'll talk about the meet cute between love and work and their very dangerous liaison. But yeah, think about it. There are all these very seductive quotes about unconditional job love out there. And I think as designers, we can probably all relate a little bit. For most of us, I think becoming designers was probably not part of a scheme to get rich fast. Or if it was, I'd like to get in on that scheme. For me and for many others, there was probably a heavy dose of idealism involved when we chose this profession. And yet I'm always a little bit puzzled when I see all these sweeping statements and quotes like this. Choose a job you love and you won't work a single day. I mean, it's as magical as love at first sight, right? Just follow your passion. It's never labor. It's unicorns and rainbows, basically, forever. I do have to wonder if the person who wrote this ever had a job. Personally, I have very complicated feelings about this quote, because even on the best of days, work is still kind of work. Sometimes it's amazing, sometimes you want to quit, and a lot of days will find themselves somewhere between those two extremes. So let's try another one of these quotes. So to be successful, you have to fall in love with work. So, okay, you might not have to have a calling. You can show up every day and love will follow. And in romantic terms, I guess you could explain this more as a slow burn, a friends to lovers story. Again, though, success is tied to feelings and not to craft. And what does it even mean? It's the first thing that you should do. It's like, is it something you tick off the list, the love, and then you're set for life? So I found that a little bit promising and overly simplistic. And so I brought another one, pièce de résistance, more or less. And because, of course, I had to quote Steve Jobs here, which I never do in my presentations if I can avoid it, but here you go to space. Then he said, you can only do great work if you love what you do. And if you don't love it, keep looking, which I personally think sounds pretty stressful, looking for a work soulmate, because there are a lot of jobs out there. Would the search ever end? I don't know. I just felt a little bit like Tinder to me. And honestly, quotes like this bug me, right? They offer this very privileged idea of a world where jobs are plentiful, and they're there for everyone's asking. And love is also a pretty sentimental feeling for something that's essentially measured in outcomes, performance, and salary. And so do I love my job? I think it's a very complicated question. And I also feel that many of these quotes are entirely one-sided, because unlike in romantic love, work can't exactly love you back. Or can it? No, it can't. And that's what Sarah Jeff says. She's a journalist and activist I came across a while back. And contrary to Steve Jobs, she urges us to fall out of love with work, because this is her main point. Job love is a scam designed to exploit you. And she wrote a book about it, which is called Work Doesn't Love You Back. And she explores something that she calls the labor of love myth. And so the labor of love, she says people who subscribe to it, and that's most of Western society really, they believe in this harmful idea that there are certain types of work that aren't really work and should be motivated by passion, not pay. And typically caregiving, housework, nursing, teaching, but also sort of passion-driven creative work fall into that. And isn't it true that even our self-image as designers is a little bit built on the idea that passion drives our work? And so Jeff created a little bit of an aha moment for me. And it felt like a permission, I guess, to question the conventional wisdom that our careers define us and that love is a prerequisite for a career worth having. And so what I did, or what I usually do when I'm in situations like where I discover someone saying something interesting, I embarked on a little research journey to find out more, or who said it better. Well, I have a bias, obviously. But I really wanted to find out a bit more about how I feel about work as an individual, but also where design as a profession falls in the spectrum. There's a reading list, like a little QR code that you can take a picture of at the end of the presentation. So you can make up your own mind. So just consider this an exploration of the tension between the two poles. So on the one end of the spectrum, job love is an incredibly coveted idea. Contemporary Western society is hung up on the premise that something that occupies us from 9 to 5 will inspire passion and purpose. So much passion, in fact, that we like to stay beyond the 5 p.m., even when we're not paid extra, because it's fun. And so we invest a lot of time and energy in finding this perfect job. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, this coveted idea of finding purpose at work is considered an entire construct, something that humans made up at some point. And it's also a harmful construct because it drives exploitation. For example, when you stay longer without being paid. And so this puts a different spin on the narratives around purpose and engagement in the workplace. And so I feel it's important for us working in this area to have an open discussion about the friction between the two extremes, because it impacts what it means to love design and to work as a designer. And I feel that the pandemic, other global crises, and time passing in general reveal cracks in the surface of what may have looked like really shiny, fancy tech jobs at a time. And I also sense the growing unrest in our industry. And so I don't know, consider this talk my attempt to stir the pot a little. Let's start with a reflection on our modern work ethic. For that, I time travel 500 years into the past to the 1500s, which were pretty turbulent times. This is not a GIF of the 1500s, in case you were wondering. Probably not. Design as a profession was still 400 years away at this time, but printing with movable type was becoming a really big deal. And so this was a driver behind Protestantism, which itself was something of a religious innovation of the time. Because until then, most Western Europeans had subscribed to a more theocentric worldview that was propagated by the medieval Catholic Church. Very simply put, Martin Luther resented that Catholics styled themselves as God's interpreter of earth and managed to get quite rich from it in return. And so Luther and his disciples turned to a more human-centered Protestant worldview that allowed for more individuality, also a bit more autonomy in communing with God. So you didn't need an interpreter anymore, basically, which sounds a lot more democratic, but came with a catch because salvation became a lot more difficult to get by for Protestant believers. And this was especially true for followers of John Calvin, who came up with a doctrine of predestination at the time. That doctrine said, if you have a strong faith and you work hard, those are prerequisites for salvation. But life is a continuous test. You'll never know if you're saved. Only God knows, and he won't tell you if enough is enough. So life is this constant striving. It's a continuous test of faith. And this created a deep insecurity among believers and an obsession with their own performance, which personally sounds actually very modern. And remember how Sarah Jeff said that this idea of finding purpose in work is a construct, even though it seems really common sense for us today. Well, this thinking that hard work and no play is the only route to salvation seemed like pretty common sense at the time. And so if you look at this, I mean, it's a mind map of the Calvinist mind. I hope I'm not stepping on anyone's feet too much here, but when discussing contemporary work ethics, I think it's really worth understanding how the DNA of our current work ethic can be traced back to Luther, Calvin, and Puritan mindsets in the 1500s. Ironically, these are folks who were really vehemently opposed to the trade of indulgences that the Catholic Church practiced. They really wanted something more democratic and simpler, and maybe unconsciously they created the building blocks of modern day capitalism. So I feel there's an important design lesson about unintended consequences in there. Anyway, consider this, like even the concept of work as we know it was invented at some point, which I think we sometimes forget. And the invention happened around the same time. Until then, people didn't really, they did what they needed to do to live. And labor was more of a means to an end, not an end in itself. So working for the sake of working wasn't really a thing. People worked for subsistence, or because they thought it was interesting, or because they made the money, but it wasn't, just work for work's sake. This may actually have started as a bit of a fad, because Protestants were quite drawn to sort of these to the sort of self-flagellating asceticism of some monks, and they imitated it in their worldly lives by working punishingly hard and denying themselves, even when they got rich, the little indulgences that came with wealth, and that made them feel more virtuous. And I find it very intriguing that the sort of modern perception of work once was a relatively posh phenomenon. So maybe not entirely dissimilar to modern billionaires who sort of rise at 4 a.m. and then go on Twitter and work long hours and then go on Twitter again and promote all this as very redeeming habits. Our ancestors would have been really puzzled at the way we work today. This concept of renting out our time to employers, giving away ownership over several hours in the day would have seemed really undignified to them, even when they were ruled by lords and working for subsistence. They were still, like having a job was considered more of an abomination. Obviously, that's a very different story for enslaved people, and that's probably a capitalist narrative for another day. But for the time being, it's just important to remember that this idea of a job is relatively new, and this is because workers, or the disliking of the idea of a job, was because most workers were at a bit of a disadvantage, right? They when they entered employment, especially as we're moving towards the Industrial Revolution, their level of freedom and autonomy was really reduced. Employers, of course, said, well, freedom of contract, nobody's forced to work for us. But, if you're poor and if you need to feed yourself and your family, then you don't actually have that much freedom. And so from the beginning, when this concept of work or job started, there was a bit of a conflict in the power dynamic between employers and employees. Despite that, this whole concept of jobs, it was basically normalized by the 20th century, and jobs became the sort of steady, if not always thrilling ambient noise in people's lives, a means to an end, working for a paycheck. And sure, if you're lucky, you love what you do, but it wasn't something that people expected. And this really changed between the third and the fourth Industrial Revolution. The fourth is the one that we're in now, I think. And so it's no longer from working to get a paycheck, but it went to working to find meaning in life. And Roman Krishnarik talked about this obsession with purpose and said we're living in a new age of fulfillment. So our great dream is it to trade up from money to meaning. We believe that a job can give purpose to our lives. We are increasingly defined by our jobs. We're emotionally invested. Finding the right job is one of the biggest goals in life. When in doubt, we consider which kindergarten to put the kids in to make sure that they will have a good job later in life. And money is important, but for those of us who can afford the luxury of choosing, we look for fulfillment and purpose, and it sometimes trumps the hierarchy of wants. And so we believe that work provides opportunities to experience pleasure, enjoyment, give us a sense of belonging, and we want our workplaces to share these values so we can bring our whole selves. And that's the discussion of the last few years, for example. But what it leads to is a blurring between the boundaries of work and life, paycheck and purpose. And what we also see is that it leads to an increase in burnout and working hours. If you think back 100 years, like in the 1920s, I think the economist Maynard Keynes predicted that we'd be working 15 hours at this time. This was based on some economical models and technological innovations, and it wasn't entirely unlikely. So he didn't come out of it out of thin air. He just anticipated that future technological progress would allow us to have loads of free time. So it seems like something's not quite working out. And I guess Keynes didn't really figure neoliberalism into his calculation. Neoliberalism is this philosophical view that a society's political and economic institutions should be liberal and capitalist. It's laissez-faire economics with very limited state intervention. If that is something you're interested in learning more about, and if you haven't done so already, I can recommend reading the Friedman Doctrine, which really outlines the spirit of neoliberalism. This whole thing values free competition, believes in sustained economic growth as a driver of human progress. And growth has happened, but the climate of neoliberalism also had side effects. It has devalued work and human happiness. And it has created or amplified other complex problems that we're dealing with every day. Climate change, a global health crisis, lack of fair income distribution, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing is that productivity and wages used to develop hand in hand until around the time that the Friedman Doctrine was published. And so when neoliberalism became a bit more popular, productivity started increasing, but wages remained low, which is strange because that was the first time it happened. And so, people in organizations kept asking themselves, like, can we be more productive, more efficient, generate more profit? You can actually see these echoes of Calvin and this continuous striving, improving our worth. It's still deeply embedded in our work ethic, I think. But what I was wondering, well, then after 450 years of striving this very same way, why would we suddenly do the same thing, but for less pay? And this brings us back to Sarah Jeff, who I quoted in the beginning, because she says in the last 40 years, there was this new tactic on the rise, or she calls it a scam, which is the labor of love myth, which emphasizes work as a place of purpose. It fosters emotional attachment to our jobs, which increases engagement. And when people are more engaged, they're more productive, and less likely to ask for extra pay for doing extra work. And so it's kind of like this. And so loving one's job is this really powerful rhetoric at this stage that can be used to create and justify oppressive working conditions, unfortunately. Of course, nowadays, fewer people take religion as a driver of purpose, and work may have taken on some of these functionalities. We'll work harder and longer because we've come to believe that high engagement will be rewarded with wealth, progression, longing, self-worth. And this creates really new complexities, I think. Our idealistic dream of finding perfection at work makes us really vulnerable. And rewards are just as randomly doled out as they were when Calvin came up with this predestination doctrine. And we can be really high achievers and work hard. During a recession, this may not be enough to save us. For many people, I think work feels precarious. It makes them feel anxious. They're overstretched and they're also underpaid. And I feel that work is broken, and that also includes design work. So understanding this idea of the labor of love, this myth, is both saddening and maddening, I think. It feels like we've been tricked into a toxic relationship that makes us, work on an empty promise of purpose, which is a tough nut to swallow. But employee activism is on the rise again, which is interesting. And it also starts reaching designers and tech companies. And especially in Silicon Valley, I think it's interesting. Silicon Valley has such a strong influence in how products and services are conceived and built and also marketed globally. So whenever something happens there, I think that makes me a bit hopeful that it may reach us as well. But traditionally, tech companies used to be very hostile, for example, against organized labor. They even dismissed the entire idea of labor or work. Like, they created all these fun workplaces, right? Low hierarchies, full of toys and games, or campuses that really supply everything. So all you have to do at home is sleep, but you have everything from food and friends there. And this isn't a total coincidence, because Silicon Valley has this really interesting value system that mixes something that I guess one could think is an opposing ends of the spectrum, but it mixes some parts of the sort of free-spirited bohemianism of San Francisco. Think of hippies dancing and flowers, but also the neoliberalism of high tech, which also happened in the same area. And so this became a source of a slightly uncritical subscription to tech determinism as well, like a high level of optimism, tech will save us. And it also shaped the kind of workers that neoliberalist companies really appreciated: very engaged, purpose-driven knowledge workers. And these folks describe as coders, as creative, as professionals, as entrepreneurs, anything except worker. And like workers in other industries, thought they were still systematically exploited. And so personally, I feel it's really encouraging to see activism in Silicon Valley. I hope that will inspire activists elsewhere. New generations certainly see that these promises of capitalism that worked for maybe us or for our parents and grandparents, they no longer really apply. And so they start fighting back. And what I personally find encouraging and interesting is that they don't just unionize to fight for more inclusivity and fairness. There have also been quite a few walkouts where employees question wrongful product decisions just for the sake of profit that would go against values. So my hope is that maybe we can leave neoliberalism behind at some point, but I do think we need to reveal its perfidy to all who are buying into it right now. And honestly, that's much of our society, probably including us today as well, because it's the main system that we're familiar with. So I think the only way to do this is by talking about it. And so that was a little reflection on how we even got here, possibly a little depressing. But I want to talk about idealism as well. Ken Sheldon, he's a psychologist, and he describes us as self-programming organisms. This means that our lives are created through our choices. And he says better choices are the ones that match our core values. They make us happier. And these choices are closely tied to idealism and intrinsic motivation. And so doing something that you have really strong personal interest in is more satisfying. And so less good choices, of course, in contrast, then are the ones that we make because of extrinsic motivation or external influences, something that we think we should be doing or that family, friends, peers, society expect from us. And the problem, Sheldon says, is that we're not really taught to make these choices well. Intrinsic motivation relies on subtle signals from your unconscious brain. It's really fragile. And that's because humans are fundamentally interdependent, and we're really primed to listen to other people's voices, external noises. And when our mind is full of that noise from external demands or suggestions, this little delicate questioning internal voice is silenced. Sheldon studied lawyers who were very unhappy in their jobs, and most of them started their journey, their professional journey, as idealists. They really wanted to help people. At the same time, later in life, a lot of them experienced high level dissatisfaction with where their career had taken them. And what Sheldon found is that idealism fueled really great performance at school and at work. And then something very paradoxical happened, which is that when external recognition for their great performance followed, that was the downfall of the intrinsic motivation, because people were more primed to react to extrinsic motivators. This little fragile internal compass got recalibrated, and more choices were made based on external factors like family, career, salary, expectations. And so over the time, the gap of these lawyers' intrinsic motivation and the reality of their day-to-day life just became quite big, to a point where in some cases had a real impact on people's well-being. You might have heard about the burnout epidemic. This is something that Jonathan Malisic has written about in his article, Work is Not Your God. And he suggests that many of us are at the end of our ropes because we allow work to be the thing that gives our lives the most meaning. Workers in previous centuries, they labored to the point of absolute physical exhaustion, but they didn't really burn out mentally like we do today. And he suggests that maybe this is because work wasn't their road to self-actualization. Today, our purpose and self-worth, a lot of it is tied up in our professional lives. At the same time, work is very emotionally intense, intellectually complex, financially precarious, in constant flux. And so more and more, we struggle to hear this inner voice, and we keep pushing to the point of burnout. And something that I found super interesting is that apparently there's a somewhat quantifiable link between burnout and how much our careers fit our intrinsic motivators. And I'll share this because it made me a little bit optimistic. So researchers had observed some physicians and noticed increased distress and dissatisfaction with the practice of medicine. And this study investigated not just meaning in general, but what are the actual thresholds of meaningful activity? Like how much of our work has to be meaningful in order for us not to burn out? Many of the physicians in the study actually met burnout criteria. And some of the factors that contributed to it were lack of autonomy, too much admin, too little time with patients, which they loved doing, or too many time for research, if that was what they loved doing, too many things competing for their time. And the burnout rate, it turned out among these folks, so there was a hypothesis, and that was related to lack of meaning equals more burnout. And they found that burnout rate was lowest if 20% or more of a physician's time was spent on activities that were most meaningful to them. And yes, that means still a lot of people suffer burnout, but I thought the part that made me feel optimistic was, okay, that is about, 20%, that is like a day per work, or 1.5 hours per work. Different from the quotes that you saw in the beginning that say you need to love your job, unconditionally and all the time and whatnot, this seems so much more manageable. I can work towards focusing on things that I really, really personally enjoy doing as part of my job for 1.5 hours per day or 1 day per week. So I think that for me, it made it a lot more achievable. When I have a bad day, I know, there will be better days or better hours, but it's not like life comes crashing down and everything's lost. I can be a bit melodramatic at times. And so again, something made me a little hopeful that maybe as a society we can reduce burnout rates at some point. And I tend to quote the Nobel Collective in some shape or form in all my talks because I find them quite inspiring and I've been following them for many years. They're an organization design consultancy based in the States. I think they might also be in Canada, Vancouver, I think. And the way they frame their work culture stood out to me in this job ad of theirs because I hadn't seen it phrased like this before. So they had this promise of meaningful work, like all job ads do, I think. But they also make it very clear that nobody expects you to find all your purpose in work or pledge undying loyalty or whatever. And I'm really hoping we see a lot more nuance like this in job ads and work cultures in the future, where it's not all, but it's one thing among many that define us. And so you may ask yourself, okay, what's design got to do with this? I think if we look at the creative and tech industries, crunch time and hustling cultures, there are these common euphemisms for really brutal work schedules on tight deadlines. The beginning of my career was in agencies, and I definitely had some tough nights there. And so careers in the tech industry, there are others like working long and working hard, like they're all indicators of ambition and purpose, and that can be fun, but there are also systematic practices to exploit and exhaust people. And so they feed off these two opposing forces, as Jeff points out. So you have this really high intrinsic engagement, strengthened by a sense of community with your colleagues, strengthened by this shared goal that you have. But then on the other end, these jobs are precarious. You could be fired any day, at least in the States. I guess work security is a bit better in Germany, but still, these jobs are precarious. There's a constant level of anxiety and stress related to timelines. There's never enough, right? There's always something else in the backlog. And so people can be stuck in this vicious circle. They don't have time for leisure, so value is only derived from the job. And without leisure, it's almost impossible to find meaning outside work. And so they're stuck. And people, interestingly, go from highs to lows uncommonly quickly. Sarah Jeff quoted this one organizer in the gaming industry who said, the distance between now my job's all right and fuck this job, I quit, is really narrow. And when people speak up, they're victim blamed for not being efficient or engaged enough, right? For not working in the system when in fact the system is working against them. Our industry also disappoints in other ways. A while back, Jiang Su Ellen made some comments about finding purpose in UX, and she did so on TikTok. And it's a really fun video that I can really recommend. I'm just showing the quote, but find it, it's great. So she really poked fun at her youthful enthusiasm that led her to think that designing buttons was the answer to why she's alive. Didn't take her long to find out that wasn't really the case. And frankly, I feel her, I've been there. She's not the first idealist who starts out wanting to find her purpose in design and then kind of got caught up in the trappings of modern economy. And I think that also sort of mirrored something that Jeff Hammerbacher said. He's a former Facebook data engineer. And I think even that's more than 10 years ago, but he said at the time, he was super disillusioned with the promise of tech and said, like the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That sucks. And so these examples also illustrate the big gap between the intrinsic motivation that led people to design or the tech industry and the reality of their jobs. And then there's this other myth in creative work in the creative industry that we have that isn't always helpful. And so I tried to summarize it a little. So we have the labor of love myth. I think the creative industry draws a lot of people who love design intrinsically, really. But also the labor of love myth, I think, is a strong force for us. But Mike Monteiro, again, someone I can strongly recommend to read. he points us towards this other myth, that of the magical creative. It's kind of a lumping together of artists and craftspeople, and we're all naturally gifted and inspired, and we're so driven by our art, like really we continue doing it even when we're starving. And that's a really attractive premise. I think it might make designers sound slightly flaky at times, but I think it also makes people think we're amazingly driven by our creativity, so much so that nothing else matters. And, I don't know, we don't need a lot of pay to work in this industry, which isn't true. So, and working in design doesn't always deliver on that. Like for some, for sure, I think there's a lot of satisfaction in the day-to-day creative problem solving that we do. But a design job, despite the name, often also comes with a lot of non-creative work. Think of or creative as in visual work, or where you produce artifacts. Like we do strategy, which is more creative thinking, tactics. There's a lot of meetings, processes, admin, all of that, management skills, and those aren't always in sync with intrinsic motivators, but sometimes they are, and sometimes we're really good at them, and then that doesn't fit with people's ideas of what creatives or designers in particular are. So it can be a bit of a catch-22. And so this reduction to the mythical creative who labors for love really sets wrong expectations and also opens the door to exploitation. Montero, as usual, puts it very succinctly: when someone tells you that design is your passion, they're about to fuck you. Design is your job, jobs are labor, and labor gets paid. I think that's fair enough. And so his advice is you shouldn't be trusting people who tell you that design is your passion. You decide what's your passion. From his perspective, it's a job, and so it should be fairly compensated. And I think in the design community, if it shows anything, it's that there is an amazing range of thinking and doing that we're capable of. I think a lot of what we do happens because we are intrinsically motivated to create things of beauty, to help people, make services better, and make this world a better place, or at least a more usable one. But that still doesn't mean that a design job is a lifelong passion project or should be unpaid. I think working in design is just that, a job with warts and all. And we're just as susceptible to burnout, economic downturns, and exploitation as other workers. And if we're very honest to ourselves, I think not all design jobs are meaningful. Design, in fact, has contributed to a lot of the problems the world faces today. And no wonder designers like Sir Alan feel so scammed. I feel that intrinsic motivation is a superpower, but it's also our kryptonite. So where do we go from here? Is there any way that we can facilitate creative careers that remain enjoyable, varied, but also balanced? I'd like to say we should go back to our roots, but then I realized, no, actually, ever since design existed as a profession for the past 150 years, it's always been tied up with tech and commerce. So I think it's more a change of attitude, or maybe we can refine an attitude that existed at the time. I think the profession, when it started out, like it really exploded into many different specializations, especially in commercial environments. Design critic Alec Rawthorne calls this design as practice, and she contrasts this with design as attitude. That's a concept that the Bauhaus professor Mohaly Nagy wrote about. Attitudinal designers, she says, are agents of change. They utilize design practices in collaboration with other disciplines, for example, anthropologists, data scientists, and doctors. And Rawthorne's collaborator, Paola Antonella, describes this as a Renaissance attitude, combining technology, cognitive science, human need, beauty, to produce something the world didn't know it needed or was missing. And so it sounds like something that maybe the robots aren't coming for yet, that we could do. So I think my encouragement would be to spend time with yourself, right? Try to separate the external noise from your inner voice, to discover what, there's plenty of purpose out there, if only we dare to make the jump. And then, yeah, of course it had to be head away, right? And I'm almost done, and thanks for your patience. I think the question in the end then is, what is job love, right? And I think, honestly, only you can answer that for yourself. And the purpose of this talk was to hopefully give everyone a little bit of helpful context and to make folks understand that, yes, there is a labor of love myth, and it wants to make us believe that our job defines us and that our dignity is tied up with it. And that's simply not true. And people sometimes find that surprisingly challenging to accept or even discuss. I remember a situation where I admitted to team members that maybe I didn't love my job every day. And that was a really awkward pause there. That was strange. And so I think we sometimes address some of the dysfunctional parts about work. But yeah, of course, it's difficult to admit that we've been collectively bamboozled by the promise of purpose for the past 40 years, maybe. So let's have a more honest conversation about the ways work isn't working for us today. And I think debunking the myth of the labor of love is one step forward. And then we can also start focusing our attention on what would truly give everyone joy, satisfaction, purpose. And maybe it is in work, but maybe it also isn't. And that's entirely okay as well. And I think loving design and also working as designers, we might be primed to be a little in love with our work. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think we should make sure that our enthusiasm is not used against us. And then as a postscript, we had a romantic meet cute in the beginning. I gotta say, if I saw love and job and they met in a bar at the moment, I would probably tell love to run for the hills. I'm not sure if it would be a happy love story right now. But I am an idealist, and enemies to lovers is really a popular trope in romance narratives. And so I don't know, maybe work is just a bit misguided and can change for the better. And I want to believe that there's still hope that things can change. So thanks.
Excellent, Hertje. Thank you. Hey, that was amazing. I'll make sure to share slides and reading lists, books you can read, all these good things. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, reflections.
Awesome.
Anybody wants to go first? Yeah, Johannes, why don't you take it away? I think you're on mute, though. Yeah. All right. Someone else, perhaps. Are you ready, Johannes? No. All right. Anybody else wants to jump in? Sarah wrote, very thought-provoking. Thank you. I thought it was very thought-provoking. I liked it a lot. Glad we made it possible. Christina, did you want to say something?
Number one, that was a beautiful talk. I've been experiencing this personally, and it was so nice and refreshing to hear that again, especially when you said, make sure our enthusiasm is not working against us. Anyway, I'm going through that now. So I'm wondering, where do you go from here? How do you approach your day-to-day work life now?
Yeah, that's an absolutely fair question. I think I did notice a little shift. I think, like, I was starting to research this. Obviously, a grain had been planted, or a seed had been planted at some stage, right? Which is why I tacked onto this topic to begin with. I mean, I still get too hung up on work things. But I do notice that there is a little bit of a balance there, or that understanding the mechanism of how this works can also can help me sort of see the systemic or the system around it, right? And see myself functioning in it as an actor, and so distance myself a little bit from it. At the same time, I am a team lead. I am very engaged at work. And of course, it is my job to also, ensure that other people are engaged at work. But I do try to make sure that their enthusiasm is not used against them, right? That I allow them, or that I hope I am someone who allows them to say stop when it's too much, or to give themselves permission to prioritize things and make sure that private life is prioritized. I think from personal experience, like, how often do I sit and work a little bit longer, just this final thing, but it's always time with family or friends that's impacted.
Thank you, Hertje. I think that's all we had. We made it. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of it from Hertje's favorite countries. Really appreciate it. See you again. Hope to reconnect again soon. Let's keep this conversation going. I think there's hope, but I think we need to also perhaps educate ourselves on this topic. It was quite refreshing to have a session without the mention of ChatGPT. So thanks also for that.
I can tell you that I started drafting my outline in ChatGPT, but it was so generic that it didn't get me anywhere. And then it spit out some fake quotes from Noam Chomsky, so it wasn't super helpful. But
All
yes.
Thank you. And really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon. All the best.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.